Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this live community forum about infrastructure and facility needs. We appreciate you taking some time to join us here this evening. I'm David Mustonen, Communications Director for the Dearborn Public Schools, and tonight we wait a minute. Oh, and tonight we have the pick is in. And selecting with the number 2 pick in the draft is, I'm sorry. No, wrong program. Sorry, that comes up a little bit later. It comes up a little bit later this evening, 8 o'clock, and we're all waiting to see what that is going to happen there. But tonight, even more excitement right here in the Dearborn Public Schools as we talk about infrastructure and facility needs in our district. We want to thank everybody for joining us on our live virtual forum. We have some live guests also joining us here this evening in the boardroom. And before we get started here, I'd like to take just a moment to introduce our superintendent of Dearborn Public Schools, Dr. Glenn Maleko, who will say a few opening words to get us all going. So, Dr. Maleko.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that. And thanks for reminding me about the draft. I know that we say that's the Super Bowl for the Detroit Lions. So we're going to be out there after, although I'll be at the Etzel Ford performance this evening because we have a lot of great things going on with students. And that's one of the things I just want to mention briefly is appreciate everyone joining here in person and online. And I'm glad that we're able to offer this because when talking to the board, we wanted to make sure we provide and receive input from the community, and that's what we're doing right now. We are going to be having another discussion on May 9th at the study session regarding a potential bond or other options that we may be looking at. So we thank everyone for their input and for those who have participated in these different events that have occurred, these different town halls throughout the district. There's a lot of great things going on in our district with our students. Right now is an exciting time as students are getting accepted into college, scholarships, all the things that are very positive. And, we have that 95% graduation rate, 86% college admission rate. We've had blue ribbon schools and other things showing that our students are extremely successful. Today we had the Care to the Core event, and we saw the students in action throughout the district. Promoting positive events in the district. But one of the biggest challenges we know facing our district, we're a large district with 35 buildings, 41 school programs, and aging infrastructure is the infrastructure that we need to address at some point. And so that's why we're here. About a year ago, I probably would have said COVID was the biggest issue, and I think we all could have said that. But long-term, really, I think the infrastructure issues and looking at that, both on a short-term and long-term plan, are very important. So, David, thanks for hosting it. Thank you to all those who are in person and those who are joining virtually. Again, I will be leaving a little early to join the Etzel Ford performance tonight with our creative students. But I have been at most of these events, and we know we're taping them, so myself and the board will be able to see the feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maleko. Appreciate those opening comments. And plenty of great things going on in the Dearborn Public Schools, especially tonight, opening night for Etzel Ford and the theater program over there. But tonight, for about the next hour and a half, we will be here. We will be here at this forum, live streaming on our Facebook platform, on our YouTube platform, and on cable channel 19. There is an online forum that's been open for a couple of weeks now where people can submit questions. And for those joining us here, you can submit your questions on the kiosk located just over on this side of the room. And we look forward to getting to those questions a little bit later on, but I'm going to get right into our presentation and talk a little bit about a variety of topics, and we'll try to cover them as quickly as we possibly can. So starting right off, so why are we here? Why are we doing these forums? This is the fourth community forum that we have done. We just completed 3 over at the 3 high schools, and we have 2 more coming up next week, one on Wednesday at River Oaks at 3 p.m. and one on Friday at 10 a.m. at Salina Intermediate. So there's still a couple of opportunities to take part. we want to update everybody on, the current status of the facility needs planning going on in the district. We're here to learn a little bit, maybe a little bit about school finance, and a little bit about our district history. I want to share some information about the Vision for Infrastructure and Planning Committee, the VIP committee that has done a lot of work in a short amount of time, January, February, March, and they present it to the board, and we'll talk about that as well. Provide a little bit of some possible ideas on how to address some of these infrastructure needs that we have. And then also, if there are questions out there, we want to get to some of those questions that pertain to this particular topic of infrastructure and facility needs and planning for the future and those areas. So that's kind of where we are. That's kind of the rundown for tonight and how it's going to go. When did all this start? Started just post the November 19th election. We did have a bond election in November. It was defeated at the polls, 400 vote difference, so very, very close. And shortly after that, we did a lot of post-election debriefing and talking about how we were going to engage the community and talk to everybody about plans for moving forward. And of course, then we all know what happened in March of 2020 with COVID hitting. And then after that, we did do a community survey. We hired an outside firm, Zogby. You may be familiar with the name. They do a lot of polling, and not just in the state of Michigan, but nationally. And they did a community survey for us back in November of 2021. And then, or March of 2021, and then in November, we gathered people together, put out applications for those interested in being part of the Citizens Committee, that VIP committee that I talked about. They began their work in January and March. They presented to the board, and here we are in April. We're doing these community forums. Our Board of Education asked us to come out, do a few more of these community forums, gather some more input from the community and get some feedback to kind of find out and gauge how members of the community are feeling and get their input and some ideas as well. I guess that spoiler alert at the bottom there really is, there is no final plan at this time. There is no ballot proposal at this time. That's why we're here. That's exactly why we're here. We're here to try to gather information and solicit that feedback, so to help the board use that as one data point in helping them make that determination of what should we do moving forward. And there are some ideas that have been shared with the board, and we'll share those with you later on in this presentation, actually right at the very end of the presentation. So that's kind of that hook to drag you in and keep you here listening to me for a complete 45 minutes, which I know sometimes could be a challenge. But I will try to keep this entertaining and keep moving through it as quick as I possibly can. I'd like to start off with a little bit about the history of the Dearborn Public Schools. Sometimes people don't realize how old this district is. Been around since before the 1900s, actually late 1800s. Some of our schools date back, the history of our schools date back that far back. The original Dearborn High goes way back to then, and then it was a K-12 building. Also, Miller Elementary. The current Miller Elementary is the fourth Miller Elementary in Dearborn. The second Miller Elementary was actually attended by Henry Ford. So and all four of those Miller Elementaries were pretty much in that same spot that the current one is at. So that's a little bit of interesting fun facts there. But the district as we know it, the district that we know today, the Dearborn Public Schools as we know today, was really formed in 1944 when you had the Dearborn Public School District and the Fortson School District. And those two districts kind of came together and merged at that time. Actually, Fortson was the district that took over the Dearborn Public School District. But because the city was also changing names to Dearborn, the school board at that time felt that it was probably best to incorporate the same name. So in 1944, those two districts merged, and pretty much that's the district that we know today, except for that small little portion of Dearborn Heights that's part of our district now. That was added in the 1970s. Some state laws changed that required districts to have a high school in their district. They did not have a high school in their district, and we annexed that River Oaks Elementary, and at the time it was Fairlane Middle School. Now that's the site of our Berry Career Center, our Dearborn Heights campus. We have about 5 different programs housed over there, ranging in grades from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade, and a variety of programs over there as well. So it's a little history of our school district. I also think it's important to point out some of the size of our district, just to kind of put in relationship how big of a district we are, how big our budget is per year. We are the 3rd largest school district in the state of Michigan. As far as enrollment goes, there are some other districts who are bigger than us geography-wise, obviously, especially some in the UP. But district-wise, enrollment-wise, we are the 3rd largest district in the state, and you can see some of the demographics there that we point out. There are 34 buildings in the district. Average age is about 68 years. You can see how that spreads out over the different buildings where they are, several of them over 90 years old. And we have a couple, actually, Salina Intermediate. That building is 100 years old this year. They celebrated their 100th year anniversary a few years ago because there was a different Salina there, and that building was torn down and then the current one was built. So they celebrated a few years back. But Duval Elementary, that building is actually 100 years old this year, and they will be celebrating in just a week. They'll be celebrating their 100th anniversary on Friday, May 4th. We invite everyone to come on out for that. And of course, you've heard about the big, awesome, incredible Fortson 100-year celebration as well. And here's the best part about that. Fortson, the actual building, won't be 100 years until 2028, and we get to celebrate all over again. And that's going to be kind of exciting. But this year, they're celebrating that 100 years of that Fortson tradition because Fortson, that name, has been around for that length of time. And that is going to be a fabulous celebration for Fortson. That, too, coming up in a couple of weeks. We also want to put things a little bit, it's kind of hard to kind of picture, 34 buildings and all these buildings and, how does that compare? What is that like? And how many square feet is that? Well, if you put all our buildings together, we're actually 6 times bigger than the Henry Ford Museum, 2 times bigger than Fairlane Mall, and just a little bit bigger than the Ford Assembly Plant. So that kind of hopefully will help put in perspective the size of the district, how much square footage we have in this district, and how much we cover. If you look at attendance-wise, too, you can see how our attendance is every year, how many students, what that actually over 20,000 students, how that kind of translates into actual people in buildings every day, and comparing it to some other things. Now, we all hope, right? We're all keeping our fingers crossed that Comerica Park will have more attendance this year if the Tigers do a little better, hopefully, right? I mean, come on. Miggy just hit 3,000. That drew a lot of people out. So hopefully we'll have a lot more people out there. Transportation-wise, we move a lot of students, about 5,600 students daily. You can see how many miles that adds up to. I like that. The little stat in the middle there is the one that I really like. The 400 acres, which equal to about 1,600 homes. I think we can all relate to that. We all have our own landscaping, our front lawn, our back lawn, and we take care of that. We cut that grass or shovel the snow in our driveways. And so just kind of to put into perspective what you think about what you do in your own home and then how that equates to what we do here in the Dearborn Public Schools with the over 400 acres of land. So that's a little bit of background on our district and our size and our history. And I'm going to talk a little bit about school finance, and I'm going to kind of break this down into 3 different areas. And first, I'm going to talk a little bit about our general fund, how we are funded by the state, how that happened and where it went. And that's the money we use every day to run our district. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about ESSER funding. That is the money that school districts across the state, across the country received as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And those are federal funds, and we've heard a lot about those funds coming to the schools. And we're going to share a little bit about how we spent those funds and how we are spending the funds that are still owed to us and coming to us. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how schools across the state finance big ticket item projects, whether it be building new schools, adding on to schools, or tackling large infrastructure projects across the district. So that's how this section is going to break up a little bit, and I'm going to kind of move through each of those. This first one is we're going to talk a little bit about funding for schools, how schools are funded. So prior to 1994, all of your taxes that were collected in the community stayed right here in the community. So Dearborn collected taxes for their schools. That money went to run the schools. It went to operate the schools. It went to do additions to the schools. And that's how things worked before 1994. Now that worked out great here for us in Dearborn. We have a strong tax base, lots of residential, lots of business, and that helped us out a great deal. So for us, it was good. But there were a lot of districts throughout the state, especially smaller districts, those in rural communities, those that didn't have as big of a tax base, or maybe more of an industrial tax base and not a residential tax base. Their funding wasn't as much as many other school districts. So it created this large inequity of funding throughout the entire state. And so someone came along with this idea in 1994 called Proposal A, and it actually had a couple of goals. One, it was aimed at balancing that per pupil funding across the state, creating equity across the state. It also was aimed at lowering property taxes. And if you also remember, that's when we changed from 4 cents on the dollar to 6 cents on the dollar, with those 2 additional cents going toward school funding. So that all changed in 1994, and what happened then is the money that was collected in your city, in your school district, it went up to Lansing, and then Lansing divided that up on a per pupil basis. And that way, everybody kind of got the same amount. Now, there were some exceptions to that, and please, this is a very 30,000 foot level explanation of how this works. So the money then went to Lansing. Taxes collected in your community went to Lansing and were divided up. And actually, this was a good thing. It really balanced out the playing field, and many school districts that had very low per pupil student funding then were raised up, and it created a lot more equity and provided a lot more opportunity for students across the state. So how did that look in Dearborn? What was that per pupil funding for us in Dearborn starting back in 1994? And you can see where it all started, just a little under $7,000. And as the years went on, that number increased, and because tax bases increased and there was more money, and so money went to the schools. And then if you notice, there's that little part there where it kind of plateaus out. That was that part, that era in time, that recession that occurred in the 2000s, and then you see a huge drop off at about 2011, and that's where school funding had a dramatic cut. There were pay cuts across the district, not only in our district but in many districts. Staff members across the board took as much as anywhere from 3 to 6% pay cuts. Staff were laid off in the middle of the year. I will have to tell you, I was around at that time, and it was a horrible time for schools across the state. And then you can see then after, as the economy kind of picked back up, you can see that a dollar amount increased, but it wasn't until about 2020 when we actually reached back to that figure of per pupil funding that we were receiving from the state back in 2011. Taxes, right? We all have very, very big conversations, and this is the hot button topic right now throughout Dearborn, are the taxes that as homeowners we face. This is just kind of a breakdown of where those different amounts go to. The Dearborn Public Schools is responsible for that 6.17. That's part of a hold harmless, and that relates back to the 1994 funding changes. And that's a whole nother discussion. I could spend another hour and a half talking about that 6.17. And we can do that at some point in time. But tonight, just to keep things focused on what we're kind of talking about tonight, I'll talk about that 3.5 mil rate there, that school debt millage. So that's the millage that the school district assesses onto its residents, and the money that's collected there is used to pay off debt. It's the bond debt. We sell bonds, right? We go on the open market, we sell bonds, and then we get revenue from that, but you have to pay it back. And so we collect revenue from the residents and we pay back those bonds. I think the easiest way to think about bonds and how that whole system works is to think about your own home mortgage, right? So you can refinance your mortgage at a lower interest rate. We do that with our bonds. I'll talk a little bit about that too. Also, you take a mortgage for 20 or 30 years, and depending on how long you take it, it will impact the interest rate. Same thing when you go out on the market and sell bonds. So we'll get into all of that stuff a little bit later on. But I just want to kind of see how this shakes out. The 3.5 is what we're going to really be talking about tonight. And also, I just think it's important to point out, just for transparency here, the RISA taxes. That's Wayne County RISA. That's the county school district that we are all part of. That is their millage, that 5.45. That's their millage that the county approved. We didn't put that on the ballot. The county did. But we do receive revenue from that. So we do receive funds from that. So just wanted to point that out as well. So how does that 3.5 mils affect homeowners in Dearborn? And this is just kind of a overall general chart. If you look at maybe what the market value of your home, you may know what the market value of your home is. Usually, not always, usually the taxable value is about half of what the market value is. That's a kind of a good rule to follow. It's not hard and fast, but it's a good rule to follow. And you can see what that 3.5 mils, how that impacts homeowners in the city of Dearborn, depending on the value of your home. And down at the bottom, I just want to talk a little bit about that 3.5 used to be 5.8, and why is that? Well, as we pay off debt, that rate drops. Also, when we refinance bond debt and at a lower interest rate, we can pay it off quicker. So when we pay it off quicker and we refinance that at a lower interest rate, that too also helps that to drop. And then also when taxable values go up as well, we're only allowed to tax so much. So that's another reason why that's dropped. But the important part there is to see that tax rate has dropped over the years, and it will continue to drop. And we have a graph that we'll show a little bit later that really shows how that's going to play out over the next year and 20 years, and comparing that to some other ways of generating revenue as well. So that's how schools are funded. That is how we get our general fund dollars, and those general fund dollars that we collect, that the state sends our way, that's how we operate our schools. That is the bulk of the money that we receive. That is how we operate our schools. That pays all of the salaries of all of our staff. School districts usually run about 80 to 85% of their budget is salaries. We are a service industry, and so we employ a lot of people, 2,700 people. So that's why a lot of that budget goes for salaries, and that's typical for school districts to spend that much of their budget. So if you're spending 85% of your budget on salaries and on the people, then the other 15% goes for everything else. It goes for all of the supplies and paying the lighting bills and the gas bills and buying supplies and all of those types of things. So that's kind of the general fund budget. That's kind of how schools are funded. And that's that little section of this presentation. Next, I'm going to move on to the ESSER funds because they've been talked about a lot in the news lately, especially over the last few years. And they were released in phases. You can see here when they were released, when those different funds were sent out to school districts. And in fact, phase 3 ESSER funds, we haven't even received all of those yet. And how did we spend those funds? Well, in the first wave, those funds were, they were very specific parameters were given to us on how school districts could spend those funds. What did they go for? Things like PPE. They went for devices that we use to help in the cleaning process. They went for technology. Chromebooks. We changed overnight from a brick and mortar school to a virtual school district. And so a lot of the money went for that. It went for social emotional learning. It went for a lot of programs. And it also went to pay staff because we had to keep staff employed. And so that's where a lot of those beginning ESSER funds went. ESSER 2 funds, see that a big chunk of that went for our summer school program last year. Again, that's what those funds were meant to be used for students, for learning, for teaching. And it was very important that we did whatever we could to try to get kids back into classrooms, back into that learning environment. Remember, they were in a hybrid environment for a while, coming in a couple days only. They weren't with all their peers. There was a lot of discussion about how that isolation of students was going to impact them, the loss of learning. And so the summer school program was designed to help with all of those kinds of needs, to bring students back into the classroom, get them interacting with other students again, and also get them back into learning. It was never meant to catch up. You're not going to catch kids 1 year of learning up in a summer school program, but what it did do is it did help to get them back and ready, and it did help keep them moving forward during that time. We spent a lot of money on that program, and it was the biggest program that the Dearborn Public Schools had ever done for a summer school program. Over 8,000 students took part. It's actually one of the biggest programs in the state of Michigan. And so we're very proud of what we did there, and I think that if you talk to a lot of the teachers who were part of that, a lot of the administrators and a lot of the students, they will talk about the very positive experience they had last summer. We're bringing that summer school program back this year. It's not going to be quite as big as last year's program. Instead of 8 weeks, it's only going to be 5 weeks. But it is still going to be that very robust program to help students get that support that they need. So the third round of ESSER funds that we're scheduled to receive and we're looking at, a lot of that is going to go for, we've committed a lot of those dollars to building improvements that are allowed by the federal government. So heating and cooling system, HVAC. I know a lot of people talk about air conditioning, but it is really more than just air conditioning. It is entire heating and cooling systems that to move air. We have those systems already in our schools, but we need to improve those. And now the federal government said, listen, you can use your ESSER funds for those types of projects. If we wanted to build a parking lot, you probably couldn't use ESSER funds for that because that's not related to COVID or improving the environment of the building. But things like HVAC, and obviously if you're putting in an entire new HVAC system, you may need new power to go with that. And so that would qualify under the ESSER 3 funds. A little caveat I just want to throw in there because some people say, well, wait a minute. You could have spent ESSER 1 and 2 funds on HVAC. I've read it. Yes, absolutely. The government changed that. When it first came out, you could not. But because a lot of school districts were not able to spend all of their ESSER 1 and 2 funds, when ESSER 3 funds came along, the federal government then said, if you have any leftover funds, you now can use them for these projects. So that's just a brief overview of those ESSER funds. Now, if any of you visit any Dearborn Public School, we have an awesome poster that really it has all those charts I just showed you. right in the poster. You can take that home with you. We have so many extra copies. You can take those home with you. You can study it. You can research it. Do whatever you want. I tell you, if you want 10 of them, come over to my office. I'm over here at the central office. I'll give you 10. I've got plenty of posters. We want to get those out. Look forward to seeing everybody over here picking up at least 10 of them. Okay, so that's a little bit about ESSER. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about how do school districts fund those big projects. How do they get that money to build schools, to build additions, to take on the large infrastructure projects like putting on new roofs and all of those kinds of things? Well, in some states, which this graph shows right here, the state actually provides the funding for that. If you look at the states that are just white, those are the states that there is no money comes from the state for those infrastructure projects or those big ticket item projects like building new schools. If you look closely, yes, that is correct. Michigan is one of those white states that does not provide that funding. So there's got to be some other ways that school districts do it. Well, there are some ways that a school district on their own can do that without going to the voters, and we've done that here in Dearborn. So what we've done, and the Board of Education has made this commitment to maintaining our buildings and making sure that they are going to last a long time, and they did that many years ago before I ever worked here, way back in the early 90s, late 80s. And there's a building and site fund. So what that is we take those general fund dollars that come to us from the state of Michigan, and we take a portion of those and we set them aside every year, and they're dedicated just to do projects, those big ticket item projects. Now, are they going to be enough to build a school? No, absolutely not. But are they going to be enough to address infrastructure needs like roofs and parking lots and windows, replacing boilers and things like that? That's what that's meant to do. It's kind of a yearly budget like we all have in our own homes. We always set aside a little bit maybe for our upkeep of our home, the maintenance on our home. We all know that even if we buy a new home, we know that eventually, maybe 20 years down the road, it's going to need a new roof or it's going to need some other structural improvements. So that's kind of what that building and site fund is. And I've got a great graph that shows how that recession, remember that recession where we took that big hit in funding? It will show you how that building and site fund also took a big hit, which really caused a lot of the problems that we are facing right now, kind of open the door there. So building and site fund is one. I talked about refinancing bonds. That's another thing. When you refinance bonds, you can save money because you're lowering the interest rates. So the money that you were putting toward paying off those bonds, you now can take that extra money and use that to fund other projects. That's one way of doing it. And you can see in our history, we've refunded bonds several times. ESSER money. So that's another way. When you have a windfall of money that comes in from other sources, then you use that money for infrastructure needs. And then energy improvement bonds. So we've done this a couple of times too in our district. And what we've done is we've had companies come in and said, listen, you're wasting a lot of money in lighting and in heating and cooling. Let us come in for this amount of money. We'll replace all of your heating and cooling control mechanisms, your lighting control mechanisms, and then with the money you save from your bills, then you can use that money to pay off those bonds that you used to get all that work done. So we've done that as well in Dearborn. So these are all methods that school districts, not just us, even though I like to brag about us, like we're the only ones who do it in the world, right? Because we're great. But actually, school districts across the state do this. This is not any magic formula or anything like that, but it is a way that school districts use it. Since 2019, a lot of people say, well, what did you do? What have you done since that 2019 bond? Well, about $8.8 million invested in infrastructure needs. You can see some of those things that we've done here. I'm not going to read through all of those. And And what are we doing moving forward? Well, approximately $80 million committed to infrastructure improvements in the district moving forward. A huge chunk of that we saw in that graph, right? Huge chunk of that coming from those ESSER funds, but also from money that the school district that we have from, remember that Wayne County enhancement millage, or that Wayne County millage I talked about several slides ago. So we have money coming in from there that we've been able to push aside a little bit and save some of that. So we've got some different ways and that we've accumulated some funds. And so there's a commitment there to address a lot of these infrastructure needs that way. But how do school districts do it for the big stuff, right? Like I said, for the, to build new schools that are, 60, 80, $100 million for a new school. Capital improvement bonds voted on by the voters. The voters approve us going out and selling those bonds on the market, and then to pay off that to implement a millage, to assess a millage on the homeowners. We can do non-voted improvement bonds, so it's a much smaller amount, but we could say, listen, we could take so much out of our general fund every year and use that money to pay off some bonds, and we're going to go out on the market and sell those bonds. But obviously, it's a lot less amount. And then the conservation improvement bonds, that's what I talked about, doing the energy kind of stuff. We can do a building and site. We can do a sinking fund. A lot of people have heard about this. This is a sinking fund. Is a way of generating revenue. It's not that large dollar amount, but and it is set for a shorter amount of time, but you don't have the interest charges with that. Recreation and playground millages is another type of millage that school districts will often do as well. I think, the one that's been talked about a lot is the big bond issue. That's the one a lot of people are familiar with, where you go to the voters and it's, 200 or 500 million or whatever it might be. Ann Arbor did one a few years back for $1 billion. And so people are familiar with that kind of a bond issue. And then a sinking fund, that's another one, where you go to the voters and you say, voters, here's what we want to do. We want to assess up to 3 mills. We can set the mill rate, 1, 2, or 3 mills, whatever we feel that the voters will support. And you say, we're going to assess 2 mills, and we're going to do it over a 10-year period, and that's going to generate a certain amount of money every year, and we're going to use that money specifically for these needs. Both sinking funds and bond issues, those funds can't be used for salaries or anything like that. You can't use that for the operational cost of your district. You can only use those funds for these big, infrastructure type projects and some things like that. So there's advantages and disadvantages to each. The bond issue, the disadvantage is it's over 20 or 30 years. You're paying that interest back over that time. Sinking funds don't have that interest, but they don't generate as much money, and it's only for up to 10 years. But the board can end that sooner if they wanted to.